Hello everyone and welcome to the NSTA web seminars where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Today's seminar is titled, How Do I Select Phenomena to Motivate Student Sense Making? Our presenters are Tricia, Shelton, and Ted Willard. My name is Carolyn Moore and I will be moderating today's program. Let's get started with an introduction. This is the first of 4 web seminars in a series focused around three-dimensional teaching and learning. The April 12th webinar is titled, How Do I Promote Student Modeling? The May 10th webinar is titled, How Do I Promote Student Discourse? And the July 12th webinar is, How Do I Develop a Storyline for a Unit? To register for any of these web seminars, you can go to the URL that I'm going to post in the chat window now. And now I'd like to present our presenters this evening, Tricia Shelton and Ted Willard. Ms. Shelton works with the NSTA on a number of projects related to NGSS, including the Train the Trainer workshops that take place at the NSTA conferences and the summer institutes. Tricia comes to us from Boone County Schools in Kentucky. And Ted Willard is the director of the NGSS at NSTA for the National Science Teachers Association, and he oversees the content of the NGSS at NSTA Hub. He also is responsible for the development of the Atlas Science Literacy Volume 2, and he did that when he worked at the AAAS Project 2061. You can read more about their dedicated presenters that we're going to have this evening at the webinar website where you registered for tonight's program. And because together they represent several decades of experience and expertise, I'm sure you're going to all want to be reading more about them. So while they're talking today, I'm going to put that URL in the web chat window. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce Tricia and Ted. The mic is all yours, my friends.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. We're going to talk a lot about, oops, did something, okay. We're going to talk a lot about phenomena this evening. We're going to hopefully get a good understanding. I hope you all are comfortable and know what phenomena are, or a phenomenon is. And I'm hoping that if I go and say phenomena, it brings up to mind the Muppets. Because I'm going to really start you off here just to get a sense of what phenomena are by putting a little earworm in your mouth. And I take much more credit for being a science educator than I do for being a singer, so forgive me if I on this piece here. But here we go. Phenomena are events in nature. Phenomena. Let's investigate phenomena are events in nature that scientists and students investigate and then try to explain. How many of you have heard that phenomena song before? If you could, you're up in your choice window there. You can click yes or no as a check mark to work with. I want to see if that will be something that will stick with you. So something to help you just a little bit in terms of getting this. Later on tonight we'll put a link into a YouTube video of that Muppet song so you can listen to it. I don't want to do that right now because I do not want to try to compete with the Muppets this evening. I have a feeling I would lose badly, but I am a big Kermit fan, so there you go. Here's a different piece of work that we could look at here, which is the framework for K-12 science education. And again, using those little check marks here, please check yes or no if that's a book that you are familiar with, have looked at, and have worked with. I think we're getting even more yeses on that than we did on the Phenomena book, the Phenomena song. That's good to know. So, but the reason I'm asking about this, and it's relevant to tonight's piece here, is that you can see here the word phenomena or phenomenon appears 114 times in the framework. You know, a lot of usage in that book. And so it's something that is really important in terms of three-dimensional teaching and learning. Another piece here, this will be last of my little quizzes for you like this. I'm going to clear out the piece here again and ask one more time. How many of you are familiar with the equip rubric? And again, we're getting a pretty good response. A few people. The equip rubric is something you can look up. We'll put a link to that a little bit later. to share with you is a rubric designed to evaluate instructional resources, lessons and units, for how well aligned they are to the next generation science standards. You could also use it or modify it to use other three-dimensional standards if you want to. But the reason I bring it up tonight is if you go and look at it, the word phenomena appears quite a few times as well in the rubric as well. So when you want to be looking at resources that are really focused on the standards, a real key here is to be thinking about phenomena. And that's why in this How Do I series, we decided we would start with phenomena tonight to get some feeling about it. The rubric itself even has a whole section that focuses on explaining phenomena and designing solutions. And I'm just going to give you a quick chance to get a sense of this, because this important point here that we want to be really having students investigating phenomena or designing solutions. That should be what drives student learning. Students are asking questions and prior experiences related to phenomena or a problem that will motivate them to engage in sense-making or problem-solving. And again, we want to focus the lesson to support students in making sense of phenomena. It's not just a startup piece that we use of phenomena as a sort of kickoff, and then we go off and we then teach the way science was traditionally taught, with me as the boring lecturer at the front of the room and just reading about it. The whole process should be about helping students understand phenomena, helping them try to explain phenomena. And then we get to Merriam-Webster here, which gave a definition as phenomena such as an interesting factor event that can be observed or studied and is typically is unusual or difficult to understand or explain fully. That seems to be the most relevant phenomena to work with. Some people talk about discrepant events as being related to phenomena, and while all discrepant events are phenomena, not all phenomena are discrepant events. And we should be ready to think about broadly of how different ways we can use phenomena through all of this. But we'll get into some more ideas about the criteria about phenomena as we go along. And so some questions we're going to try to answer tonight is this idea of what are phenomena, why are phenomena such a big deal, how are phenomena related to NGSS and three-dimensional learning, how do we use phenomena to drive teaching and learning, and what makes phenomena effective for instruction. And as a way to do this, I'm going to call upon Brian Reiser, professor at Northwestern University, who I like to refer to as the godfather of NGSS. It's because he's from Chicago. I think that fits him well. But he was on the committee that developed the framework for K-12 science education. There's been a lot of other work around NGSS. He's actually going to be one of our presenters later on in this whole series talking about storylines. But he did a video that I'm going to ask you all to watch right now that goes into answering some of these questions about phenomena. And so I'll pass things to Carolyn here to get you started on that video.
Okay, thank you, Ted. So you'll see in the chat window the URL, and you go ahead and click on it. And when you get back from watching the video, use that green check mark again to let us know you're back. If you're watching the archive right now, everybody is viewing the video clip in the chat window, and we'll be back in just a moment. So it looks like people are starting to come back. So in a few seconds, we'll continue on with our program.
Great. So hopefully folks found what Brian had to say there helpful into understanding some big pieces about phenomena. The big piece, I think, in trying the biggest idea in all of that work is this shift that we're looking for with NGSS to move away from learning about science ideas to figuring out phenomena. So this ultimately, we want to get away from the idea that I, as a former physics teacher, am going to teach my kids Newton's laws, and that the kids are focused on learning Newton's laws. Instead, we want to have them exposed to various phenomena, such as a cannon being fired, or a train pulling a caboose, other situations, a person running, things that involve force and motion, and trying to explain the relationships between force and motion so that they ultimately are developing their own understanding of what those scientific ideas are. But it's not science ideas just for the purpose of science ideas. It's science ideas that help ultimately help explain phenomena. And then we're going to get into the aspect about how students engage in their practices, and that engagement is how they interact with the phenomena. So ultimately, we have phenomena, this event that we need to explain, that leads us to questions. And so we have questions about the phenomena. How does it take place? What's going on here? How is it that when I have a glass of ice water sitting out on a humid day that we end up with water droplets on the outside of the glass? We then can work on modeling that phenomena. We can work on explaining it. We can try to design a solution to a problem. There are investigations that we can conduct. There is data that we can analyze. There are models that we can construct, arguments that we can engage in. And all of those different practices come into role here. And through that, we ultimately come up with new ideas. We have new ideas. Those new ideas, may be right at the first go. They may not be right at the first go. We need to test those ideas out on new phenomena. And as we try out new phenomena, we will lead us to further questions and further investigations. So what pieces of the DCIs, the disparate core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts did we figure out? What new ideas do we have? And what questions do we have? All of those are part of our process going on through here. And so this cycle of phenomena leading to questions, leading to practices, engaging with the phenomena, leading to new ideas. And so I really find it useful to think about phenomena as breadcrumbs, that these are the things we're going to use to guide our students. So for example, when I have students who have looked at the condensation, the water droplets on the outside of the glass, their first idea about this, which may be very reasonable, is that those water droplets on the outside of the glass came from the water inside the glass. That's a very reasonable model to work with. They needed some water from someplace. There was a source of water to work with. Now, if I'm presented with that, then I could, in theory, tell them, no, you're wrong. This is where it really comes from. But that doesn't require the students to really engage in their own thinking. So instead, imagine a different phenomena that I bring forth. I take a block of metal that I'd had in a refrigerator, and I put it out in that humid weather, and water droplets form on that. The model that they had to explain the water droplets on the outside of the glass doesn't explain the water droplets on the outside of, on the surface of the piece of metal. So we need to basically work to develop a new model. The students are going to need to modify the model. So rather than me telling them that they're right or wrong, I can use phenomena and present the phenomena in different ways to help them go through that process. And it's important that we as teachers make use of phenomena in that way to guide our students and help them along the way. I like to think of it as various forks in the road that they could take, And we can't expect them to do all of the investigations that could possibly be done. Isaac Newton, who I understand was a pretty smart guy, came up with his 3 laws of motion over a period of years. We want our students to develop an understanding of these things in a matter of a few weeks. So we need to basically help them in certain ways. So when there are forks in which ways that they can go, we could in theory say, take this one, this is the way to go. But if you've ever dealt with a teenager, telling them which way to go and do something is not the way to get them to ultimately do it frequently. Instead, we can kind of play the role of, oh, what's that bright thing down that path? Let's take a look at that. That can lead them to where we're trying to get them to go. And so think about breadcrumbs as the things you sprinkle out and that you use at selective times to get their thinking to go farther and further in this whole process. So there's a lot of shifts in thinking that go on when it comes to phenomena. And I've got on this page here a whole bunch of different shifts to consider. And what I'd like you to do is just to take a moment, read through those, and pick out one shift that you think is the most important shift in what's going on here. And just type out in the chat why you think what one you think is the most important shift. And if you feel like it, you can type in why you think it is. And so I'm going to give you just some quiet time to read through those and pick a shift. Jacqueline likes the idea of students own the thinking of the doing. Barbara talks about moving from just the initial hook, and she likes how it's a great path to misconceptions and a broken promise. Rachel raises a question about engagement. The whole idea is that phenomena are engaging. They are motivating the students to lead them to what's going on here, Rachel. But it's not just the fun in of itself. It's something that really sustains them throughout the investigation. Tricia will talk a little bit more about this later. Like Logan's got this deeper questions and driving investigations. So a lot of good pieces there, and hopefully you can go back and look at some of these pieces. We'll point you to a handout that has all of these different shifts in place. So how do we deal with phenomena as we are planning some pieces here? I like to give you a little bit of a sense of how phenomena are central to how I think about planning lessons. We all know that in NGSS we start with a performance expectation. But I pretty quickly jumped from looking at a performance expectation to looking at the disciplinary core ideas that make up a performance expectation. The Performance expectation is all about assessing what students are able to do at the end of instruction. The DCI is really, in this case, is meant to help students as they, is really the raw material the teacher works with in trying to help students develop those ideas. But we know that just telling kids those ideas isn't going to be the way to do it. So instead, I start to think about what phenomena are out there that in order to explain that phenomena, you need to know these disciplinary core ideas. So as I work with that and identify and brainstorm some phenomena, that leads me into thinking about, once I've got those phenomena, how do students interact with that phenomenon? How are they engaging with it? Are they going to be conducting investigations about it? Are they going to, analyzing data? Are they going to be making a model or constructing an explanation? The ways they interact with that phenomenon leads you into what practices you're using in your lesson and throughout your unit. And once I've established the disciplinary core idea and the practice, I then start to look at what cross-cutting concepts really tie and fit neatly together with that. And so it's important to realize that while the core idea is definitely tied directly to the performance expectation, the practice and the cross-cutting concepts may or may not be the ones that are used in that performance expectation. I'm actually going to be using lots of different practices throughout my lesson to help students understand a disciplinary core idea. And I'm going to choose whichever cross-cutting concept in a particular lesson seems most appropriate and important to what's going on in what students are doing in that lesson. And then some criteria that we've developed here at NSTA in sort of thinking about what to do with that phenomena. The key piece, obviously, is that it's got to be addressing the targeted disciplinary core idea. If it's not relevant to that, then it's really not, not going to be useful in helping them learn it. This idea of it being observable. Can they observe it directly? Can they see it? Can they hear it? Can they touch it? How are they interpreting it? But we need to keep in mind, we want students to learn about volcanoes. We want students to learn about earthquakes. We want students to learn about stars and planets, that sometimes you can't have a first-hand experience. I would have loved to have been able to take my students, to Mars, but so far I've not gotten a budget for that in any of my requests. So sometimes we work through other people's experiences. We deal with it vicariously. Another key piece is how comprehensible is it? Can students understand what's going on here? Is the relationship to the DCI element, that bullet in the DCI, clear and easy to comprehend? Are the procedures you have to go through something that the students are ready for and capable of doing? We won't want fourth graders to have to plug and go through a significant algebraic equation in order to do something. You've got to think about how it relates. What other ideas do students need in order to interpret the phenomena? If they need to know certain things about energy that they don't know yet, in order to understand this idea about weather, this phenomena about weather, is it the right phenomena for what we're trying to work on? And keep in mind that it's attention-getting and thought-provoking and requiring some explanation, so it's likely to engage all students and motivate them to focus on the DCI element. Now, there's a lot packed into that statement. First, this point about all students. You've got to think about who your entire student population is that you're working with. And that's where you, as a teacher who know those students best, will be able to judge what's going to work for them. But then the aspect of, all this aspect of attention-getting and thought-provoking, keep in mind, is a means to an end, not an end in itself. If a phenomenon is just engaging from a sort of whiz-bang standpoint, gee-whiz method, but it doesn't really get them thinking about how does that happen, then it's not doing what you need it to do. You need it to motivate them to ultimately really want to understand what's going on there, what that DCI is. And then finally, is it efficient, and that the benefits justify any costs that are involved in here, any time devoted to using the phenomena with students. So those are the pieces that play out important in trying to pick out a phenomenon. And so with that in place, Carolyn, can we stop and take a couple questions?
Thank you, Ted. We do have 2 questions. The first one I'm going to talk about is from Brianna, and she asked, will you also talk about modifying NGSS units for states that haven't adopted them yet?
Sure. The general principles that we're discussing here can be applied to any science instruction. The main difference is if you're not working with the disciplinary core ideas and the elements of the disciplinary core ideas in your state, you still have science ideas you want your students to think about. And so you could still you want your students to engage in practices still in that process. So you want to think about what phenomena are relevant to that scientific idea that I'm trying to help students understand. And then how are students going to engage with that phenomena? That's where the practices come into idea. And how can I ultimately make it so my students are the ones who are developing their own understanding of the scientific idea rather than me just telling them what that scientific idea is.
Thank you, Ted. We have another question from Lynn, and the question is, what if the students have been given information so long they do not know how to ask questions anymore?
So one thing that is absolutely true is that this is not the way that many teachers have been trained to teach or have spent time teaching. It's going to be very different for our students to begin with. And in the classrooms that I've seen where real great work has been going on, you ultimately see that a lot of work is done at the beginning of the year to create a classroom environment, to create a culture where this process is there. And you're going to have to, as a teacher, deal with it at the beginning of the year. Your students are used to you just automatically giving them feedback. Am I right or am I wrong? And you're not going to want to do that. You're ultimately going to be doing what scientists are doing, which is ultimately saying it's not so much that I'm right or that I'm wrong, or that somebody doesn't tell a scientist, oh yes, you understand the world properly now. You end up with that the evidence best supports this explanation. And that's what your typical science paper says, is that the evidence we've collected supports this explanation for this being the way the world works. And so that's what you're going to have to deal with in some ways in terms of how this all comes together.
Thank you, Ted. And we have a question about this lesson planning that we're talking about right now. Is there a copy of this on the NSTA website?
So I think the slide deck and this process that I just described is put together in the collection for this web seminar. You could correct me if I'm wrong on that, Carolyn. And then there are some other resources that we can point out to you on the hub, or also some things that are available. I would encourage you, if you'd like to learn more about actually designing lessons like this, the Discover the NGSS workshop that NSTA does goes into this whole process in much greater depth than I'll be able to do in tonight's web seminar. But it leads, and also following along into what you'll see in the coming weeks, especially with Brian Reiser kind of designing a storyline, will follow very much into this flow.
Thank you, Ted. Yes, we'll put the collection URL back in the chat window again at the end of the program. I'm going to have you answer one more question, and I just want to throw this other one out that we're not going to answer because I just think it's a great one. Rachel had asked, in the future, could NSTA have a webinar where it is a giant think tank for phenomena? But then I do want to get this one question in here from Kathleen. She says, I am a special ed and teaching chemistry, and the phenomena are not always directly connected, but are hidden in the atomic level and inferential thinking. And it's a struggle for my students. So how do we make it concrete and visible and safe?
One of the big aspects here is finding the right phenomena is not always easy to work with. And it does, certain abstract concepts require a certain level of abstract thinking. But there's a lot that we can build off of and work with. as we'll see in a little bit, there are some of the simplest phenomena, like why do you smell cookies in the oven when your mom or dad is making some cookies for you, can actually lead to some thinking about that hidden in a world at the atomic level. And so we'll come back to that a little bit. I think Tricia will get a chance to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much, and we'll continue on, and I'll keep monitoring the chat for additional questions for later.
Great. So I'm going to pass to my wonderful co-conspirator here this evening, someone who actually really does know what's going on in the classroom because she is in the classroom, Tricia Shelton.
Thanks, Ted. Welcome, everyone, and I'm excited to share a little bit of my classroom with you this evening. I am in Kentucky. This is my 22nd year in the classroom, and we are 4 years into implementation. So when I reflect back on my second year of NGSS implementation, developing an understanding of the power of a strong anchor phenomenon stands in the forefront is one of the biggest game changers in our classroom. High school students literally running into class, excited to figure out the next piece of the puzzle on the road to understanding the phenomenon. This anecdote illustrates the first two criteria on this slide. They hook the student interest, and students are unable to immediately explain the phenomenon, but instead need to investigate it with a sequence of science and engineering practices to figure it out. In this way, phenomena drive the instruction to help students engage in the practices to develop the knowledge necessary to explain. The game changer status for our classroom also came with an understanding that the focus was not just on the phenomenon itself, but also on the student-generated questions about the phenomenon. That's why they ran into class. Student questions are important to them and are a critical piece of the excitement and the motivation to figure out. Sticking with this emphasis on student questions, as you can imagine, a classroom full of students could have many different questions about the same phenomenon, opening up multiple lines of inquiry. A good anchor phenomenon builds on everyday or family experiences while also being interesting, unexpected, or puzzling to the student. Take a minute to read some of the other characteristics often shared by good anchor phenomena and consider how engaging with a strong anchor phenomenon can serve as an on-ramp into class discussion and the classroom community for all students.
Trish, we
Now
lost
that we
you.
have established, do you have me back?
Sound good now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Now that we have established a working definition of phenomena and some shared characteristics of good anchor phenomena, let's look at a few more examples. In this example, students want to build science knowledge to understand how a singer could shatter a glass with his voice. In this example, students are using the phenomenon of how a tiny seed could become a massive tree by working to figure out the driving question. Where did that mass come from? How could that happen? With this anchor phenomenon, students are engaged in building earth science ideas in the context of their application to understanding phenomena in the real world. We have seen with each of our examples how a strong anchor leads us to a driving question that we are compelled to explain, like this one. Why does a cannon recoil when it is fired? Let's think back to all of our examples. The singer shattering the glass with his voice, the seed becoming a large tree, the patterns in earthquake activity, the recoil of a fired cannon, and the smell of peppermint spreading throughout the room, as seen here. Let's leverage patterns and think about the similarities between these examples. Based on these examples, what are the characteristics of an anchor phenomena? Please share a response in the chat window. So Terry shares that they are observable. Brianna, they are simple, straightforward. Let's see, interesting, relatable, intriguing. That they motivate an understanding of processes, relevant, familiar to students, not able to be explained without learning. I like that. I can't just immediately explain it or immediately Google it. Tangible to students, open questions. Greg shares a connection to the practices and cross-cutting concepts to understand them. The desire to know and an answer not being obvious. A connection to using the students using the 5 senses to explore. And phenomena also being able to elicit student misconceptions or preconceptions. Thank you so much for all of those answers. So if we revisit, this is one of my favorite slides that Ted shared earlier. Hopefully we can see, as Dr. Reiser stated in his video, the process of figuring out makes what we are building in the classroom much more meaningful for kids. It is the phenomena and the student-generated questions about the phenomena that guide the learning and teaching. Students feel a need to engage in the science and engineering practices to build the pieces of the puzzle, the science and engineering knowledge. And so let's revisit our peppermint oil example. And that is the peppermint oil spreading throughout the room is our experienced phenomenon that we can have a first-hand common experience together in the classroom. And then that raises a question: how can we smell odors from across the room? And that leads us to engage in the science and engineering practice, for example, of developing an initial model and an explanation. And then in the course of doing that, and through collective conversation, science talk, for example, we may see some patterns in how the odor travels. And that to smell an odor, we need the nose, odor, an odor source, and air. And we also might think of lots of other related phenomena, and really important for motivating the learning in the next step, we raise more questions. And this is one of my favorite graphic organizers. I love this graphic organizer because it demonstrates how raising more questions creates a sequence of instruction where students are working to explain the anchor phenomenon with other investigative phenomena that we can see here in these rows. And each one of these rows we can think of as a lesson. And so as we investigate these other phenomena along the way, we have our instructional sequence, where each lesson phenomena is leading to a question that motivates students to engage in the science and engineering practices, to add to or revise, in this case, our initial model of how the peppermint oil spreads throughout the room. So if we think back to that specific phenomenon and look at it with this graphic organizer, we can imagine some of the lesson level phenomenon that students might explore to develop this explanation of how we can smell odors from across the room. So I'll give you just a minute to read and scan this graphic organizer and read through some of the lessons that might be sequenced for us to understand the smell of peppermint oil throughout the classroom. And as you scan this organizer, please notice that the lesson level phenomenon in the first column lead to lesson level questions that kids investigate through the practices. And as Ted mentioned earlier and emphasized, if we scan down this list, students are using multiple practices. And in the last column, they are incrementally building understanding through the models that they are adding to and revising to over time, culminating in the final consensus model at the end of the storyline. And this is yet another way to represent thinking about how an anchor phenomenon can drive the teaching and learning in a unit. It's not just about developing those science ideas in the lessons, and each lesson is represented here, again, by a row. And those science ideas are the orange puzzle pieces, in this case, the disciplinary core ideas. But they could also be the core ideas if in a state that hasn't adopted the NGSS that are part of the curriculum for that state. But students are also developing elements of the cross-cutting concepts that they can use to connect and organize their thinking, represented here by the green puzzle pieces. And at each lesson, they have new and previously brought forth but unanswered questions with this particular lesson. And if we follow our purple arrow, that leads us then to and creates a need to engage in the next lesson of the unit, where if you take a look at the second column, we have a new lesson level phenomenon and different science and engineering practices that we are engaging with to figure out different pieces of the disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. And then even more new questions or unanswered questions that may connect all the way back to our anchor and should connect all the way back to our anchor. And that leads us to the next lesson. And this continues until we have all of the pieces that we need, all of the science DCIs and all of the cross-cutting concepts that students need to be able to explain the phenomenon or to design a solution to the problem. And then as a teacher, it's my job along that process to support and guide the questioning and the figuring out, but also to support the connecting the puzzle pieces together into that final explanation. So let's think a little bit and take a look at the very first anchor phenomenon that I used in my classroom. And this was my first experience with students actually running into my classroom. And for those of you that are high school teachers, that's one of the things that I'm a very quick walker. And so I just hate being stuck out in the hall during class change because high school students in my high school didn't usually move very fast. And so to have them literally run into the room so excited to figure out the next piece of the puzzle, that was a big game changer for, as I said earlier, for our classroom, and a really wonderful thing. And I describe that as kids hungering for new evidence when it is essential to figuring out the next part of the story. You may have heard of unit design as storylining. The way that I like to conceptualize that is as a child, I loved story time. I loved sitting on the carpet and listening to my teacher read us a book, read us a story. And I loved the anticipation of wondering what was going to happen next and how exciting that is. And so in our classroom, the phenomenon is the context of our learning, and that is our story, and that is where our anticipation and our desire to figure out that next piece comes from, very similar to that story time. So I would love if you would engage with our original phenomenon in the Shelton classroom. I have a short video that I'm going to ask Carolyn to drop in just a second. And just so everyone is under the same understanding, we watched a series of newscast videos, and a series of articles that were posted on the web and also in newsprint about the death of a high school football player. And that is how my students originally engaged with the anchor phenomenon. So Carolyn, if you could drop the link, and just so everyone knows, when you first click on this, sometimes an ad will pop up. It takes just a second to load, but the video is under 3 minutes.
Thank you, Trish. I put the URL in the chat window for everybody, and when you come back, just use the green check mark and let us know that you've returned. Enjoy the video. Participants are all watching a video clip right now, and we'll be continuing with the program in just a few seconds. I see about 30 of our participants are back already. Continue to click that green check mark to let us know you're back. It looks like most people are back now. Trish, if you'd like to continue on.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So let's remember one of our discussion points, our criteria for a good anchor, is that students are engaged in an authentic scenario that's complex enough to drive a series of lessons and interesting to the students in the room. And this was a story that this tragic death of a high school football player, the students through the videos, they got to know this young man and saw that he was a vibrant, healthy young man, and they were engaged in the story with their heart, with it at an emotional level, but also cognitively, because they had so many questions. Each group of students developed on average 20 to 30 questions. And then here is a compilation of one of the classes, and each mini think tank or triad had a spokesperson that shared their group's questions. And in this case, we did it through media, but often in my classroom, the students just record their questions on Post-it notes. And they have discussions. They initially just brainstorm as many questions as they can think of, and then I support them in evaluating those questions and categorizing them and leveraging patterns and coming up with what the group feels like are the questions that if they knew the answers to these questions, they would be a little bit closer to understanding what happened to this high school football player who died from drinking too much water in Gatorade. And Kathleen had a really great question earlier, and her question was, how do I know what questions will be asked by students? And in which case, how do I prepare and align the DCIs that the students are going to investigate? And that is a really, really great question and an essential piece of all of this. So in this case, in this unit, I opened up the questions and let the kids ask as many questions as they could think of and that they were curious about. Now, I chose the videos that I placed before them and the news articles, and so I was strategic in what I placed before them as well. But what I did is I categorized the questions into these 4 sub-questions, and I nested the student questions underneath each sub-question. And if you look here at the middle column, in this graphic organizer, it's representing the 3 dimensions, and you can see that I connected each of these lesson level questions to specific DCIs. And in this case, you can see the performance expectations and which the DCIs are part of. And also multiple cross-cutting concepts in science and engineering practices. And students also, after engaging with the initial phenomenon, the videos and the news articles, they developed an initial model that they add to and revised over time. And so what I'd love to do is to show you just a really brief snapshot into how this anchor phenomenon, the death of the high school football player by water intoxication, really drove students to engage in three-dimensional learning to be able to explain this phenomenon and what happened. And one of the things that I just referenced, in addition to being authentic and relevant and interesting, and this was one where students had so many questions, it also needs to be complex enough to get at many disciplinary core ideas. And if you look at the last two rows of this particular graphic organizer, we start out at a systems level, and then we go very micro scale at the cellular level, and we need to talk about how water moves in and out of cells and fluids, and something that I had taught for years that students did because they were kind, and I had asked them to, but they really were never very interested, and they couldn't wait to learn these concepts about hypertonic solutions and hypotonic solutions. And so the biology teachers in the webinar are saying, oh my goodness, I can't imagine students being excited to learn that. And because it was part of a need to, something that they needed, a piece of the puzzle to explain this phenomenon, it motivated the learning. And so using the phenomenon as the context for the learning, or what I call the story that we have here in our picture, this is where the students started, because in some of the videos and in some of the newsprint, it talked about how the body processes water, and it references the urinary system a lot. And so students generated questions about the urinary system and the production of urine. And those questions and all of the other questions then motivated that need for three-dimensional learning. And so again, just to revisit our phenomenon, the high school football player dies from drinking too much water in Gatorade. If you remember from the video, he drank 2 gallons of water and 2 gallons of Gatorade. This happened just before school started, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. So students became detectives in a way and recorded all kinds of information about the young man, but also about the situation, what he reported to the other students. And we came up with this driving question. If water is necessary for survival, how can such an essential substance kill us? And I'd like to briefly talk about how that driving question and anchor phenomena motivated us into three-dimensional learning. I'm actually going to share a little bit of the second lesson. So just so that we're all on the same page, our first lesson, we were trying to figure out the normal components of urine, and students conducted a urinalysis investigation. And what they figured out is that urine is made of numerous parts that can be used to determine the health of an organism, that normal urine contains certain components and abnormal urine contains others. And so this helped us and supported us in developing new questions, and we still had more questions from the very beginning about how urine was made and how the urinary system is regulated. And then that created the need to engage in the next unit. So what I did with the lesson 2 is that I started the lesson helping my students understand the cross-cutting concept of structure and function, because in order for them to understand the urinary system, they needed to understand the parts of the urinary system and their job. And so in making the cross-cutting concept explicit for my students, that helped them organize their thinking about the disciplinary core ideas that they were developing an understanding of while engaging in the science and engineering practices. This was one of the first units that we did in the Shelton classroom, and so my students were new to the NGSS and had experience thinking about cross-cutting concepts, or much experience, especially in an organized way. So we decided to use the football helmet because that was part of our story, and I walked around the room with this football helmet and asked students questions about what was the job of a football helmet? To protect the football player. What are the sub-components or sub-parts of the football player that work together to do that job? And the students would talk about the hard plastic cover outside to protect the football player's head and brain, the face mask to protect the face while still allowing the player to be able to see and participate on the team to reach the overall goal of winning. And then also the padding inside that serves as a shock absorber. So as we talked about these subparts of the football helmet and their functions and how the functions work together and how the functions had to work together while still allowing the football player to be able to see well to do his job, we set up the thinking so that we could engage in the sense making. And we chose to use the practice of developing and using models, and in this case we were using models. And I supported the students engaging in that practice by establishing some common language for us to use. And so you see some of that language on the screen, that models represent another system in the called the target in a different medium. And that target is the system of phenomena that the model represents. And that when we use a model, one of the things that we need to think about is the accuracy to which a model represents its target, because no model is perfect. That's why we are using a model and not the real thing, because we need to study a certain aspect of it, or we need to study it in our classroom and it's not feasible or safe to do so otherwise. So it really wouldn't make sense for us to, or it would be dangerous for us to study the urinary system live. So instead, I presented the students a series of models. And we started out with this model of the kidney. And so the students created this model of the kidney by placing fake blood into a dialysis bag and dropping it into a cup of distilled water. And while that was going on, we engaged with this model that the students call a bean model. And so I really, through questioning, my goal was to help them understand the science and engineering practice of modeling and also develop an understanding of the cross-cutting concept of structure and function. So we started out by just asking them, what are the components or relevant parts of this model? And so the student said, red beans. And so then I shared with them that the red beans represent something in the body. And then the students filled in the gap, and they inferred that the red beans represented red blood cells. And then they noticed that there were white beans, and the white beans represented white blood cells. And through discussion and my questioning, students developed an understanding of the relative size of red blood cells compared to white blood cells, as well as the relative number just by using this model. And then the final component that students found was rice, and that represented a waste product like urea. We also had a discussion about the limitation of a model, and that goes back to the original slide that talked about fit. And they noticed that what was missing from this model was a really important component, and that was the liquid part of blood. With our bean model, I provided them the rest of their components. They were given a colander that we identified as the kidney, and a bowl that was identified as the urinary bladder. And I challenged the students to remove the waste from the blood using their kidney. And so you can see the picture of the students engaged in that. And then it was time for us to go back to our original model and look at what had happened. The students now have urine in their initial model, And from the combining the two, understanding of the two models together, they were able to infer that this particular model of the kidney that they called the blood bag model, it must have had small holes in the outside of the bag that they didn't originally notice or see, and that yellow substance was probably urea based on their understanding developed from the model previous, and that the job of the kidney must be to clean the waste out of the blood and without letting the red part of the blood, the red blood cells, or the larger white blood cells out. So they were building an understanding of the urinary system and its various parts and what they do through the use of these models. And if we take a look at the performance expectation and the disciplinary core idea, thinking back to what Ted shared earlier, this allowed them to answer some of the questions that they had originally about the football player who died from drinking too much water, because a lot of the students didn't understand why his body just didn't get rid of that water. And so by using the model series and examining the models, merits and limitations, they're able to start putting together pieces of the puzzle about how the body responded to that large amount of water in a very short time. But then also, they're left with more questions. So at the end of that lesson, they had built an understanding of the disciplinary core idea, LS1A, that we have on the screen here. And also, they had used the cross-cutting concept of structure and function to investigate a system, and that required a detailed examination of the structures of the different components. And so you can see that that is a different cross-cutting concept than the one that is listed here with the performance expectation, as Ted discussed earlier. And then in this slide, we can see that I've underlined and bolded the pieces of that cross-cutting concept that we use specifically in this lesson. And that also, I think, goes back to Kathleen's question about how do I know which questions will be asked by students, by really making the cross-cutting concept explicit and using that thinking to structure questions in the classroom. I'm helping the students get to those pieces of the puzzle that are both disciplinary core idea and cross-cutting concept. So with that, let's pause for a few questions from the audience.
Thank you, Trish. Ted has actually been doing a really good job of answering this as we're going along, but there was one earlier from Melissa about, do you use a driving question board for your units?
Yes, I do. I am a huge fan of the driving question board, and we do it very similar to what I just shared in the classroom, and that motivates our learning. And I usually nest the students' questions under sub-questions. And as we get going as a class, the students will become very proficient. I know that was a question shared earlier, where they'll say to me, Mrs. Shelton, you know, you have these 4 questions up here already, but I think that if we chunk this group of questions together, that we might actually have a 5th category. And so they start to see how the questions can be motivated to drive the learning, and they will get up as the unit progresses and add questions to the board throughout the whole unit. They're really excited by the use of that particular strategy.
I'm going to interject here just a little bit and throw sort of an adapted question that was asked earlier about, you know, what phenomena to choose and how do you know that they're going to work. And I was wondering if you, Trish, would share, you know, a little bit of a conversation I know you had with a colleague once, Mike, who was trying out some new lessons, and in terms of what goes on with phenomena sometimes and anchor phenomena.
Sure. I think I know which story you're speaking to. One of my friends, who is a wonderful, wonderful instructor and an incredible storyline developer, he was working with a group of teachers on a storyline for a long time. and they had an anchor phenomenon that months they spent on this unit, and Mike was the teacher in the classroom with the students, so he was so excited to go in and engage the students with the phenomenon, and on the way home he called his friends in his think tank that had been working with him really deflated because it didn't register with the students. They weren't excited about it. They didn't ask the right questions. So they decided to push forward a little bit, even though the students weren't super engaged with that initial exposure to the phenomenon, and they went ahead and did the first 2 lessons. And what they found out is the phenomenon that they thought was the driver for the second lesson really was the anchor, because as soon as the students had that phenomenon placed in front of them, they had so many questions, and the questions that they were asking were directly connected to the DTIs that they were targeting. And so there is a great amount of iteration and conversations between teams of teachers that needs to happen. And so the one thing I would emphasize 4 years in is to just be patient and just to be really brave but accepting with that, because if the phenomenon doesn't resonate with the students, it doesn't really matter how well it's connected to the NGSS or the standards that you're using, because it's their questions that are driving this whole process, and so that's a must-have.
And what I think is so illustrative in that story, I like very much about that, is we know with NGSS that we want our students to try things out. They're not going to get the right answer right away. They're going to try things. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to have to revise models and do things. And so we need to also, as teachers, be comfortable with the idea that we're going to try things and that they're not going to always work every time. And that, we as, my role as a, in talking to you all about NGSS and trying to communicate it is this point of we want you to, have license. Don't feel that you have to get everything just right all the time, and it's okay. And if your administrators complain, I'll be happy to write you a note and say Ted said it was okay.
Thank you. One more question I think we can have time for here. A couple of the participants were asking how the students came to the idea that the football player died because of the water.
That was something that was shared in the different videos that we watched and in the newsprint right off. And so they knew what the cause of death was expected to be. They just didn't understand how that could happen. So even though they knew the answer, and that's the really exciting part for me about the NGSS, even though they knew an answer, they couldn't explain that answer. It didn't make sense to them. And so that's what really motivated them to walk down the path. And this particular unit took almost 5 weeks. And so that phenomenon engaged their study 4 or 5 weeks of class time, where they were just as excited at the end as they were at the beginning, because they could see their model and their explanation evolving, and that was very empowering to them. And they could see all of the science understanding that they were building. And speaking about that, we had visitors to the classroom from outside of our school building come in, and the students couldn't wait to tell them why coaches shouldn't tell athletes to drink water when they start muscle cramping. And they just really adapted that and incorporated that into their world.
Thank you, Trish. A couple of participants want to know if you are going to speak about assessment for a lesson like this.
I'm going to let Ted take that question.
We're not actually focusing hugely on assessment within this piece here, but I do think that that's a great topic that we should consider for this entirety of the series about how do I. And we'll try to look. We'll also offer you some pieces in the fall around these, and we'll look and see if that's going to be a topic that we could pull into the place here. So I think I'm going to pull us a little bit through the next piece here, because I think we're getting close to the end here, and just talk about unpacking of core ideas in all of this. I showed you this diagram earlier, and in terms of how we work through that, we are obviously focused on disciplinary core idea, on practices, on cross-cutting concepts. So this is obviously what drives our instruction, is what we are hoping our students are learning, is this three-dimensional combination of the core ideas, the practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. So an important piece here, to quote Yogi Berra, a famous baseball player, but probably even more famous for sort of interesting statements, is the whole idea: if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up someplace else. So it becomes essential, in order to pick out phenomena, that you understand the core ideas. In order to think about how students interact with that phenomena, it's important to really understand the practices. And to link the cross-cutting concepts in, you need to understand those as well. And so I have a little analogy here. I'm interested if people recognize this web page and can tell me what this page represents. Just somebody type it into the chat window. And once you've told me what it is, I'm interested in knowing from somebody what two pieces of information do you sometimes have to supply in order to use this particular web page. Origin and destination, great. And Lynn has told me it's Google Maps, great. And so in planning instruction, you have some of the similar issues to deal with. You need to know where you want your students to end up, so you do need to know those core ideas, those practices, those cross-cutting concepts, and to have them really in your head. You also need to know the starting point, where your students are right now. If I gave you directions from my house to, the place where the NSTA's national conference is going to take place in LA, you probably couldn't use those directions, those turn-by-turn directions, because I doubt live on my street. So we need to really think about, where your students are starting, where you want your students to end up. And so we have to think about unpacking those standards. And that's why I have my NGSS designated suitcases right here. And so in thinking about unpacking of standards and working to what we're going to do here, I'd like to just sort of get a sense of where you all are in terms of how you've thought about unpacking the learning goals in whatever set of standards you've been using. So we've got some choices here: A, B, C, D, E. Carolyn, if you'll take that away.
Thank you, Ted. So I've changed the polling where the check mark was to A through E. Go ahead and choose the response that best suits you. And if you are unable to do that, you can also put it in the chat window. We'll give you a few seconds to respond, and then I'll publish the results. If you're having trouble finding that letter A, it's right underneath your name, and it's the fourth icon over. Give you a few seconds.
Stephanie,
all right, I'm going to, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Stephanie had asked what letter E said, and I'll just read it to her. In addition to studying the standards and other reference documents, I discussed their meaning with my colleagues. I don't know if her screen was blocked or something.
All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and lock the poll and publish those results for you, Ted.
So we have a mix. So people either may not be familiar with unpacking, but if they are, they definitely do it, because we have no one who chose choice B. And a lot of C's, D's, and E's, D being the most pronounced there. And so for those of you who don't know about unpacking, what we're really thinking about is looking at the practices, the core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts, looking at the specific bullets, those elements that we're targeting and trying to work with, in all of this work, and really thinking about what do those mean. So for our purposes tonight, in terms of talking about phenomena, we really want to focus on the core ideas and thinking about elaborating major ideas, defining boundary conditions, describing prior knowledge, identifying student challenges, and brainstorming phenomena. This is what it's all about. This session is brainstorming phenomena. And so there are different tools that you can use that really can help you with this. One of the most important of all of this, and I've already asked about the framework for K-12 science education, that you can find descriptions of the disciplinary core ideas in the framework. There are broad pieces about that. And there's a nice little link that I'll post in a little bit that I can take you to that can tell you whatever section of the standards you're interested in working with, that you can click on that and that will take you to an online version of the framework that is focused specifically on that. Take you exactly that page in the framework if you want to use it for that. Another piece that is very important here are the K-12 progressions from the NGSS appendices. This tells you what happens in K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, how those ideas are meant to develop over time. And it's important. The assessment boundaries. This is one place where you do want to go back and look at the performance expectations because they have something as assessment boundaries and clarification statements. And sometimes what's written in those statements really helps you understand what the DCI elements are focused on that's going on here. That can make a big difference. I'll tell you that this idea in chemistry we aren't getting to the idea of atoms, or that we're saving that for a later grade. And then the last piece I want you to keep in mind is your own expertise as an educator. That you know students, the students that you deal with. You know what students, if you are a third grade teacher, what third graders are ready to deal with and to do. I will caution you that I don't fall back on this is what we've traditionally done in third grade, so this is what's appropriate. Really think about where the students are themselves. Don't think about just what your previous expectations have been, what you've done in your curriculum in the past. Think about the kids as kids and how you can help them. And so for each of these pieces here, you can, there are some different questions that you can use that can guide you about this. What's the intended meaning of the DCI element? Is there one concept or are there several separate ones embedded? If you look at the DCI elements from middle school or high school, you're going to have a lot that's said there that you would need to tease apart. A single statement may mention solids, liquids, and gases. You need to think about how each of those plays a role and what goes on with that. What's the language students are using and how does that key into it? If the core idea isn't using certain technical terms, then it's probably not appropriate for you to try to use in your classroom. The boundary conditions. What are the things that are nice to know but aren't essential? What are the things that can wait till later? Are the ideas, if you're a middle school teacher, what are the high school ideas are things that your students aren't really needing to learn yet in middle school? Prior knowledge. What are students already supposed to know in their class? It's going to be important for you to really check and see, do they have these ideas? In today's world, unfortunately, if you're a middle school teacher, the kids may not have had a lot of science instruction in the elementary grades. You may need to fill in some of those pieces. Identifying student challenges. What ideas do students have already? What misconceptions may they hold? What scientifically accurate standards do they have? How can you go about really determining what your kids have? It's nice to know what in general students' struggles are, but you really need to know your kids that you're working with. And how can you leverage those understandings? Even ideas that aren't necessarily correct, in total, are often very important ideas on the way towards the scientifically accurate understanding. And then once you've gone through those four, is this whole idea where we are, is that what phenomena would provide an example of this core idea? What I like to think about in phenomena is what is a phenomena that students want to explain, but students aren't able to explain at the start of the unit, and the only way that they can successfully explain that idea is to know the core idea. And it's not always easy to come up with that. The example we mentioned earlier of a cannon being fired was something that came to me after a good bit of time thinking about Newton's third law and realizing that if you don't know Newton's third law, it's really hard to explain why a cannon recoils when it's fired. And you really have to have that idea in order to really pull that into place. So that would be a good phenomena to use in an investigation around that leading to learning some of Newton's laws. And then these criteria for phenomena play again. I've showed you these before. I'm not going to go over it again, but just to really think about how these criteria can help you in thinking about the phenomena as you go through and you gather a bunch of phenomena to think about and deciding which ones to use, which ones to reject. And so that brings us to really all the pieces that we're talking about here. Again, this whole idea about selecting phenomena is just one piece in really building up your classroom. You're going to want your students to be engaging in models, which we'll be talking about in April. You're going to want to think about how student discourse, the discussion among students, how instead of to be you and a student talking back and forth, the teacher being a central figure in that, how do you have kids really talking amongst themselves? And then in July, we'll really tie into here about how can we take these different pieces to really start to develop a full storyline for a unit. And so thank you all for being here. I'm going to pass things to Caroline because I think we've got a few little pieces to do, but Tricia and I will stay around for some questions down the road. Carolyn, your mic's off.
Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening, and please join me with a virtual round of applause for our presenters this evening. Thank you, Tricia Shelton and Ted Willard. And the virtual applause button is on the smiley face emoticon, and some of you are finding the hands up, which is okay. I'd also like to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for sponsoring today's web seminar. And thank you to the National Science Teachers Association for producing these web seminars for all of us.